Why net zero and why it matters? To emphasize the significance, one must consider the Paris Accords activity in connection to the value of a livable climate. The best consequences of climate change must be avoided in order to preserve a livable Earth, and the increase in global temperature must be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The Earth has warmed by 1.1 degrees Celsius since the late 1800s, and emissions are constantly rising. To achieve the Paris Agreement's aim of keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, emissions must drop by 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050. Climate change has created a global emergency that transcends national borders. It's a challenge that requires international cooperation and multifaceted answers. How can we ensure that our commitments are followed through on? A proliferation of criteria, with varied degrees of resilience, has paralleled the increase in net zero promises. Subsequently, the UN Secretary-General established a high-level expert group on the net zero emissions commitments of non-state entities in March 2022 to strengthen and clarify the standards for net zero emissions commitments made by non-state entities, such as businesses, investors, cities, and regions, and to hasten their implementation. On November 8, 2022, during COP27, the expert group delivered their proposals. Fundamentally in its core, the UN Climate Change Conference, COP21, in Paris achieved considerable strides. The agreement sets long-term goals to guide all nations, review countries' commitments every 5 years, provide financing to developing countries to mitigate climate change, strengthen resilience, and improve abilities to adapt to climate impacts. These measures will aid in limiting the increase in global temperature this century to 2 degrees Celsius, while pursuing attempts to further reduce it to 1.5 degrees. A binding international pact agreement was effective on November 4, 2016. The Paris Agreement now has 194 parties, 193 states plus the European Union. The agreement calls on countries to deepen their commitments over time, and includes pledges from all nations to cut emissions and cooperate to adapt to climate change effects. The agreement creates a framework for the open monitoring and reporting of countries' climate goals, while offering a means for rich nations to help poor countries in their efforts at climate mitigation and adaptation. The Paris Agreement offers a robust framework that will direct the international effort for many years to come. It ushers in a change towards a world with zero emissions. The Sustainable Development Goals must be accomplished for the agreement to be put into practice. How does it function? The Paris Agreement is predicated on a cycle of 5 years, in which countries pursue ever more ambitious climate action. Each nation is required to publish an updated National Climate Action Plan, or nationally determined contribution, every 5 years. Countries outline the steps they will take in their NDCs to cut their greenhouse gas emissions to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement. Additionally, nations outline in their NDCs the steps they will take to strengthen their capacity for adaptation to the effects of global warming. The first global stocktake will evaluate advancement towards Paris Agreement objectives in 2023. By keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, this strategy will further motivate nations to adopt ambitious climate change measures. The Paris Agreement urges nations to develop and submit long-term strategies to properly frame their efforts towards the long-term objective. They are not required, unlike NDCs. The Paris Rulebook, commonly referred to as the operational guidelines for the practical implementation of the Paris Agreement, was agreed upon at the UN Climate Change Conference, COP24, in Katowice, Poland, in December 2018. And was finalized at COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, in November 2021. Now, in order to achieve net zero, greenhouse gas emissions must be reduced to as close to zero as is practical, with any remaining emissions being reabsorbed from the atmosphere, for instance by seas and forests. One of the biggest difficulties that humanity has ever faced is the transition to a net zero world. It demands nothing less than a radical change in the ways that we produce, consume, and travel. Around 3/4 of greenhouse gas emissions now come from the energy sector, which also holds the key to preventing the worst effects of climate change. Carbon emissions would be significantly reduced if electricity from renewable sources, such as wind or solar, were to replace dirty coal, gas, and oil-fired power. Is there an international effort to achieve net zero? Yes. An expanding coalition of nations, cities, companies, and other organizations have committed to achieving net zero emissions. Around 76% of global emissions are covered by the net zero objective that has been established by more than 70 nations, including the 3 greatest polluters, China, the United States, and the European Union. The Research-Based Targets Initiative is collaborating with more than 3,000 businesses and financial institutions to cut their emissions in accordance with climate research. Additionally, more than 1,000 cities, 1,000 academic institutions, and more than 400 financial organizations have endorsed the race to zero and committed to taking strict, immediate action to cut global emissions in half by 2030. Is the goal of net zero by 2050 still on track? The government's current obligations are woefully insufficient, hence the answer is no. The existing national climate plans of the 193 parties to the Paris Agreement will result in a considerable increase of over 11% in global greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 compared to 2010 levels. All countries, especially the biggest emitters, must significantly enhance their nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and take decisive action right away to cut emissions in order to reach net zero. Only 24 new or modified climate plans had been submitted by September 2022, despite the Glasgow Climate Pact's request that all nations review and enhance the 2030 targets in their NDCs by the end of 2022. In summary, Consumer Trading Organization Limited will keep advancing more concepts.